The world is broken. Anyone who has lived through 2020 feels that deeply. It's been a year full of frustrations and disappointments. But what if those frustrations and disappointments point us to a greater reality? We're going to talk about that with world-renowned New Testament scholar N.T. Wright on today's episode of the Science and Faith podcast. He's one of the world's leading Bible scholars, the chair of New Testament and Early Christianity at the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews, an Anglican bishop, and best-selling author. His new book, Broken Signpost: How Christianity Makes Sense of the World, is available now from Harper One Publishing. You can pick up a copy at your favorite bookstore or from Amazon.com. It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast today, Professor N.T. Wright. Dr. Wright, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So before we get started, I want to talk about your book. I want to talk about especially, these broken signposts and how they relate to the current situation that we're in with the coronavirus pandemic and all of that. So with everything that's going on at the moment, though, I want to take a step back for a second and kind of talk about the assumption behind all of these questions today. And that is, why should we be doing theology in the first place? With everything going on, we got to get the vaccine for people. The world feels broken, and the COVID pandemic has changed our lives possibly forever. Why shouldn't we be engaged in more quote unquote important or practical things like helping our neighbor, loving the poor and the vulnerable and the weak? Why have a discussion about theology when we could be doing other things that are far more practical?
A great question. But of course, nobody actually lives their lives like that, because at any given moment, there are urgent things that we need to do, perhaps as a family or for one's job. But that doesn't mean that there aren't larger questions which have to be hung onto at the same time. Often we live our lives like somebody who is so keen on getting to the destination they think they're going to get to that they don't have time to look at the map. And then when they find themselves in a strange place, instead of thinking, hang on, we need to stop and look at the map and see where we've got to, they think, oh, if I just drive a bit faster, maybe I'm going to get there. And I think our society has been very much like that, really, for the last 200 or 300 years since the Enlightenment, that the big questions were assumed to be sorted, that the Western Enlightenment said, if there is a God, he's a long way away upstairs somewhere, and we have to run the world ourselves, so there's all this urgent stuff to do. And one of the great challenges of the Christian faith, and actually of Jewish faith as well, would be to say, no, that Epicureanism, that split between a distant God and the world, is simply wrong. That whatever you mean by the word God, the true God is involved with the world and actually cares about what's going on in the world. And if you factor God out before you start, don't be surprised if you run into all kinds of problems in your rather frantic accelerating faster and faster and hoping you're going to get there. So I would say we need, for a whole society, of course, we need doctors and medical professionals dealing with vaccines and all that stuff. We need urgently wise, shrewd politicians and diplomats navigating and negotiating our very difficult worldwide situation right now. I mean, the whole question of the rise of a newly militant China and what's going on in Hong Kong, the whole question of where is Russia sitting these days, the whole question now for us in Britain of Brexit, of Britain and Europe, and to say nothing of the American situation. These are huge questions requiring mature, wise, disciplined statecraft and diplomacy. But that isn't something other than being concerned with who God is, because if God made this world and loves this world, then God wants wise humans to be following their different vocations in making his world more like God actually wants the world to be. But if we bracket theology out before we even start, those questions don't even get on the table. And I would say that's one of the reasons why we're in such a mess. So, of course, some people have to do the medicine, some people have to do this, some people... It's rather like C.S. Lewis wrote a lecture, I think, in the 1940s on learning in wartime, because students were saying, why should I study Shakespeare or Milton when there's a war on? And Lewis basically said, if it's worth doing it ever, it's worth doing it now, because the big questions that are raised by what's going on in the world are questions that are superbly handled and explored in the great minds of the past. And if we're going to reconstruct a world after this war, we're going to need people who know how to handle these issues wisely and maturely. And for that, Shakespeare and Milton, or I would say the Bible and Christian tradition, these will be of enormous help. So there's a whole lecture I could give you on this, but that's just the beginning.
And so in a way, it sounds like without theology, there's a whole part of the questions in people's mind. We talked about the practical way of caring for people, but theology in itself is a practical way of caring for people, because people have questions about why is the world the way it is? Why is the corona pandemic happening the way it is? Why is it broken? And if we did away with theology, we wouldn't be able to answer some of those questions, and we would be doing people a great disservice.
And it's surprising how quickly people who think of themselves as atheists and who live as atheists so much of the time, how quickly they will swing round and ask the big theological questions when the chips are down, when difficult times happen. That's why, I don't know if you've seen the other little book I wrote this year. It's called God and the Pandemic. This is the British edition. American edition looks slightly different. And that's really addressing that, because people at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March, were saying all kinds of weird things about this is a punishment for this particular sin that we've committed or whatever. And actually, the Bible is a much wider and richer resource than simply seeing, oh, there's a pandemic, it must mean God's cross, therefore, ... You know, the Psalms protest against that. The book of Job protests against that. But people do want to address these questions, particularly when times are tough. They say, wait a minute, wasn't there supposed to be somebody called God in this frame somewhere? And what's he up to and what's going on? And people reach for the most trivial and silly theological answers unless they have been able to learn and understand more about the depth and wisdom which is actually there in the Bible itself.
Well, speaking of the Bible, that's what your new book is based on, A Broken Signpost, How Christianity Makes Sense of the World. So real quickly, before we get into it, can you define for us what is a signpost and why is it broken?
Okay, I take this theme of signposts from actually a much longer and more academic book that, again, was published last year called History and Eschatology, which was my Gifford Lectures, which I gave a couple of years back in Aberdeen. And there I'm talking about things that look as though they might be evidences for God in the natural world. That's what we broadly call natural theology. And I argue there that there are several impulses, or as I call them, vocations, which all human beings across time and cultures know are important, such as justice, freedom, truth, spirituality is in there among them, and beauty and love and so on. And all human beings know these things matter. And many human beings think that these are actually pointers, signposts to the existence of God. Why do we care about justice? Well, because there's a God who cares about justice. Why do we want freedom? Well, because God has made us that way, etc., etc. The problem then is that though pretty well everyone cares about justice, especially if they think that an injustice has been done to them, pretty well everyone is prepared to bend the evidence in their own case, or indeed international justice. We all care. We want the world to be wisely ordered, but we actually want our country to come out on top, or at least doing rather better on its balance of payments. And so at every stage, what looks as though it might be a pointer to God actually lets us down. The signposts break, and they leave you with, I had an email the other day from a friend in America saying, basically Jean-Paul Sartre's question, if all these things really do let us down, doesn't it look as though life is just a sick joke? We have these impulses, these senses that maybe life means something, but in the end it's all darkness, and it's just a mirage. It looks as though these are taking us somewhere, but actually there's no God. These are just bits and pieces of our genetic inheritance from an earlier evolutionary stage, and we shouldn't pay any attention to them. And that's the point at which the Christian story comes in and says, let's talk about Jesus and see what happens then to these different signposts. And that's where the book comes in.
In many ways, it's connected to the question of the problem of evil, where we have good things that kind of point to a greater reality that we call God, but they're what you call signposts, but they're broken signposts, and so we almost feel like there is no God because these signposts that point to a greater reality are broken.
Yeah, yeah.
So in Western society, then, as you look at it as a broad culture, do you see one particular signpost or two that you think Western society sort of tends to focus on or struggles the most with understanding?
Yeah, yeah. I think at the moment, the obvious one would be truth. And we've all been battered with this over recent days, partly because of all the language surrounding the American election about fake news and alternate facts and so on and so forth, and conspiracy theories, which can go back and back and back. There's no stopping them. This was, of course, what Dan Brown did in the Da Vinci Code, but actually it happens in real life that people think, oh, it looks as though this is true, but actually what's going on is there's some sneaky people round the back somewhere who are manipulating the evidence to make it look like that. So we're not going to be taken in. But then as soon as you think about those sneaky people doing that, there may be other even sneakier people round the back of them. And the whole thing becomes a hall of mirrors, and we don't know what to believe, who to believe, etc. Of course, there are some brute realities that if you catch COVID and die from it, then as you're dying, you might think, death feels like reality in that something is happening right now to me or to the person I love. And all this talk about the whole pandemic just being a scare tactic to make us think this or to get us vaccinated with some dangerous potion, whatever, maybe actually that was wise. But the whole question is, once you stop trusting people in authority, particularly once you stop trusting people who are serious scientists, then all sorts of things can go out of the window. And I see this as the long-term result of, in some cultures, particularly certain bits of North American culture, by no means all, people who have grown up being told that the scientists are wicked and atheistic and they don't believe in God, and therefore whatever the science says, you can't believe it because
Right.
we have the Bible instead. And that split has then generated a situation where even when a wise, deeply mature, well-taught Christian like Francis Collins, who's head of the National Health Department or whatever it's called in the
At the
White
National
House,
Institutes of Health.
that's the one. Francis, who I know well, he's a good friend. He is a fine Christian man, and he's a fine top scientist. And the thought that you might say, oh, well, because he's a scientist, he can't be a real Christian, that this has dislodged the idea of evidence and truth. And so, culturally speaking, we've gone from the high modernity of the rationalism of the 18th century and so on into the post-modernity, which says all truth claims are in fact power claims. And we've gone beyond that again to say any truth claim coming from somebody who claims to be a scientist, we know ahead of time must be wrong. This happens with the climate change debate as well. Oh, the scientists are saying that. Well, we know they're atheists, and so they're nasty left-wing people, and we good believers, we don't take that seriously. And so the general public gets befuddled, wants to know, how can we know what truth is? And I was having a debate online with somebody just the other day about this. And I think there's a real crisis for America, but also for the whole Western world. And philosophers have written about truth and truthfulness. You know, we all want, governments want, churches want, filing cabinets full of documents in order to be sure that we know what happened when such and such was going on. But we probably don't believe the documents when we then get them out of the filing cabinet and look at them.
Right.
It's as though we want more and more truth as a sort of stabilizing thing, but we don't know how to get it. And it's into that world that the message of John's Gospel, particularly, which I explore obviously in Broken Signposts, where Jesus says, I am the way and the truth. And then when Jesus is facing Pontius Pilate, Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus gives this wonderful oblique answer. Instead of saying yes or no, he says, I've come to tell the truth. And Pilate says, truth, what's that? But actually telling the truth about God's world is the most powerful thing that can be done. Jesus is speaking God's new creation into existence, which is the fulfillment of the old creation with the broken signposts mended. That's a bit more complicated. Most people oscillate between a kind of easygoing evidentialist thing, truth simply means fact, simply means you can measure it or whatever, through the postmodern thing of saying it's all a claim to power, and then we're lost and we don't know where to go. That's where the church needs to learn and to teach how to do truth in a more holistic way. My goodness, it's a massive challenge.
It is a massive challenge, and you mentioned just briefly just a little bit ago about how we've transitioned from that modern to postmodern phase, but as we talk more and more, and we examine culture and society and how they're reacting to truth. One of the 7 signposts in your book, truth is becoming more and more suspicious. Not just it seems like Western society isn't just now discounting science and scientific truth, but it's almost as if all truth, we're almost like we're seemingly transitioning out of postmodernism into this new phase of where we used to say scientific, the new atheist scientism, where the only source of truth and knowledge comes from science, where now we're kind of filtering out of that, so to speak, and we're coming to this new stage of we can't believe anything is true. We can't trust anyone. I don't know if Corona maybe has accelerated that or not, but now we've kind of abandoned religion. That's irrelevant, and now we're kind of coming out the other side of this scientism aspect of our culture and saying that only science can give us truth, and that there's basically sort of no truth. So, and then you mentioned in your book, and I promise this is all tied together into one question. So you transition from talking about truth to talking about spirituality, and while you mentioned that while religion is in decline, Christianity might be in decline, spirituality is actually on the rise. And there seems to be this growing interest in spirituality. And so you started to talk about it there briefly before I started this long monologue. And that is, what do we do as the church? How do we combat this weird fluid society that we're in, where you've got facts and no facts and truth and no truth, but at the same time spirituality is on the rise?
Yeah, and and it's a funny thing, because the split between religion and spirituality, which so many people make today, that they say I'm spiritual but not religious, that's the standard line, that is entirely predicated on the meaning of the word religion or religious, which was recoined in roughly the 18th century. Up until that point, religion had tended to mean liturgy, what people did in church. That was religion, how you ordered a worship service and so on. But then from the 18th century onwards, religion has meant humans trying to get in touch with or having some relationship with a distant deity or something like that. And because of the latent Epicureanism in Western culture, which, as I said before, is basically God is a long way away if he even exists at all. So then religion is people going into funny buildings and doing odd things, hoping that they're getting in touch with this distant divinity. And people say, well, that leaves me cold. That really turns me off. And it's often very moralistic and silly. But I do have this sense of other dimensions to life, which are deeply important to me. And in my heart, I know there must be something more. And I feel it when I look up at the night sky or whatever. And of course, this is a perfectly normal human reaction to what in some cultures would be called signals of transcendence, that we humans are somehow aware of other dimensions of life than simply what you can touch and see and weigh and measure. And because of that, there is enormous confusion in the Western world, where people want spirituality, but the last place they expect to find it is in church, because they assume that churches are about this religion thing, which they've dismissed out of hand because of what the 18th century said religion now was. And that too was always a power grab, because it was the philosophers of the Enlightenment who wanted to run the world themselves, and so wanted God out of the picture. And their Epicureanism is a classic case of a claim to truth, which was actually a claim to power. And we've been living off that for the last 200 or 300 years, and it hasn't done us any good. It's produced world wars and Holocaust and gulags and 9/11 and the whole thing. So it's time to put the package back together. But how can the church, how can Christians, how can theologians, preachers, etc., how can we do this? And the answer has to be that in being people of prayer ourselves, in being people who are trying to follow Jesus ourselves, we should naturally be reaching out and drawing others into the circle of prayer, into the circle of being Jesus' disciples, which doesn't just mean a narrow bit of teaching about some dogma and ethics, though inevitably truths about Jesus and truths about the best way to live a human life are part of it. But the church from the beginning was always outward looking, because God is outward looking. God is about generous love, and the church should be about generous love. St. Paul says in the first letter he wrote in Galatians, while we have time, let's do good to everyone, especially those of the household of faith. The church should be known as the place where people look to for help. It's happening in my society at the moment with the pandemic and all that. The church is organizing more food banks and things like that, and care for people who are stuck at home and can't get out to get food for their families and so on. It's the church that is doing all that stuff. And when the church is seen to be and known to be doing that, and weeping with those who weep, quite literally, then people say, what is it that drives this? And then we have to talk about Jesus, and not in a simplistic way necessarily, but because we are being Jesus in the power of the Spirit for and with those people who are in the most desperate need.
And I would agree with you, and I think it's so important that the church sort of incarnates, for lack of a better word, the Jesus that came 2,000 years ago and is the hands and feet of Christ in the community. But one of the objections that I face here in Germany, and I've talked with other pastors and theologians and normal Christians in America, and they get a slightly different version of this, is through German history from the Reformation on through the 20th century, the church had a very, very strong influence over society and culture. It was very powerful. And they've only just recently, in the last 100, 200 years, Germany has broken that power of church and of the marriage between church and state. And no German is interested in going back to sort of this Christendom culture where the church and the government are married together, influencing each other and having tremendous amount of power. In the United States, you have just recently this year, this flood. It's been coming for several years, but it seems 2020 and 2019 really hit hardest. This flood of evangelical leaders who have come out and had to resign for various abuses, and Jerry Falwell at Liberty University. There's scandals surrounding Ravi Zacharias. There's just in the news this week, there's the pastor for Hillsong. There's just this tremendous amount of brokenness in the church. So we're talking about the church needs to be the hands and feet of Christ incarnated in the world to spread the gospel. The church itself, as a signpost that's pointing to a greater reality, is broken. And so how do we overcome that to reach a culture that senses and right now feels very keenly that brokenness?
This is something that the church has always functioned best at street level. The leadership level is always a risk, and I speak as somebody who obviously has been in church leadership for some while. That when you're, as it were, up there, not that you really are up there, and you know in your heart of hearts that you're simply an ordinary person, an ordinary Christian along with everybody else, but people put you on a pedestal, and that's a very dangerous place to be. I am fortunate in that I have a wife and children who don't let me stay on that pedestal for 1 second longer than necessary, and do everything they can to remind me that I have feet of clay and that I belong down in the dust with everybody else. And that's a lesson we all do need to learn. But the church, being the church, is not the great statements of the great leaders, not even the great sermons of the great preachers. The church being the church is when people, having said their prayers in an ordinary, humble, daily way, notice that down the street there is a neighbor who needs something, and go and help supply that need. And that multiplies out, where a group of 3 or 4 people in the church come out of a Sunday service and they're chatting. And isn't it a shame that because of the downturn in the economy, all the banks in town seem to be shutting, and poor people can't get loans to help them through? And is there any way we could found a little credit union? And I've seen this happen in the northeast of England, in the old Rust Belt where I used to work. And that kind of thing, where Christians are doing creative things on the street which say, actually, Jesus is alive and well. And this isn't about the great leaders who then have, yes, like Humpty Dumpty, they have a great fall and a crash. And that's always tragic, and it's always a scandal. And we need to pray for church leaders and preachers and so on, because they are vulnerable. They're in a very risky position. But we have to remind ourselves that it's what goes on at the street level, at the ordinary familial and friendship level. That's how Christianity spread originally. Christianity didn't spread because people like Irenaeus and Augustine were great preachers, though they were. Christianity spread because people saw ordinary people on their street who had stopped worshipping the idols of the society, which was always a dangerous thing to do. You'll get into trouble if you don't worship the gods. But instead, by following Jesus, they became the sort of people that everyone wanted to have as neighbors. And so then everyone wanted to say, well, what is it that makes you different? And that's what we have to remind ourselves again and again and again, and especially, as I say, for myself as a church leader and teacher.
And that's really the pattern that we see in Acts. We see in the Gospels Jesus taking ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, normal everyday people, not powerful leaders, not Roman consulates and generals and centurions, but not the powerful, but the weak, and forming them into a community. And then in Acts, the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and they go out and they do their ministry. And that's essentially what you're saying, is that's what we're called to today.
Yeah. And the possibility of being deceived and of thinking yourself to be above all the problems, when in fact, well, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, anyone who thinks they're standing up, watch out, because there's a banana skin around the corner. That's freely translated, you understand, from 1 Corinthians 10. But that's what he's talking about, that anyone, anywhere can be extremely vulnerable. And when a church leader does something which hits the newspapers in a scandalous way, then, oh my goodness, that is just such a shock. It's a horrible thing.
Well, his new book is called Broken Signposts: How Christianity Makes Sense of the World. It's available from Harper One Publishing. So be sure to pick up a copy today at your favorite bookstore or on Amazon.com. That's where I got mine. So yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate you taking the time today, making time for the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you very much. It's very good to talk to you. And as I said, thank you for some great questions. These are huge issues, and it's exciting to talk about them. Thank you very much.
Well, you're certainly welcome, and thank you for taking the time to answer them. So if you guys have a question or a suggestion for a future topic of the episode, please feel free to email us. The email address is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com, and be sure to send those in, and we'll do our best to answer them. Can't guarantee that Professor Wright will answer your questions, but we'll do our best to answer them. Be sure to check out our website, scienceandfaith.de. That's scienceandfaith.de. And we will see you next time here on the Science and Faith podcast.